They thought they could bury me along with their dirty secrets. They believed a perfect courtroom facade, $1,000 suits, and local political power could crush a scarred loser like me. But my arrogant stepfather made one fatal mistake. He thought my scars were marks of weakness, and he dared to scream my tactical call sign in the middle of an open trial. He had no idea that name just awakened a national nightmare waiting right outside in the hallway. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for your incredible support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization because we no longer have the budget to operate. We are forced to pause all new video uploads here for the foreseeable future and transition our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories with longer runtimes, deeply detailed scenarios that we cannot share publicly on YouTube, and multiple emotional voice actors bringing every scene to life. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our protagonist, a 34-year-old woman named Ruth Carlson. The servers at Vanguard Horizon Systems never slept, and neither did I. The subterranean data center was kept at a constant 62 degrees, a temperature that kept the multi-million-dollar mainframes from melting down, but always made the phantom pains in my left arm ache with a dull, rhythmic throb. I am 34 years old, a former cyber warfare officer for the Joint Special Operations Command, known in the darkest corners of the intelligence community simply as JSOC, in the military. I hunted digital phantoms and dismantled enemy networks before they could pull the trigger. Today, in the civilian world, I worked as a forensic data investigator for one of the most powerful defense contractors in the United States. My job was to clean up the messes left behind by corporate spies and careless executives, but the mess staring back at me from my dual monitors was no ordinary corporate espionage. It was treason. A catastrophic national security breach had just hit Vanguard Horizon, the entire blueprint architecture for the West Coast power grid, detailing every critical substation, routing vulnerability, and fail-safe from Seattle all the way down to San Diego, had been siphoned out of our classified vault. This was not a hacker group looking for a ransom. This data was sold directly to foreign oligarchs for tens of millions of dollars, giving them the literal power to plunge half the country into the dark ages with a single keystroke. The perpetrators were not faceless ghosts in some overseas warehouse. They were my own family, my stepfather, federal judge Preston Caldwell, and his biological daughter, my half-sister Chloe. Preston was a man whose gavel struck with the absolute authority of a god in this state, cloaking his corruption behind a perfect judicial facade and bespoke suits. Chloe was a vicious corporate lawyer who negotiated back-channel deals with the warmth of a starving reptile. Together, they had orchestrated the sale, betraying their country for offshore bank accounts. But high treason leaves a massive footprint, and they needed a fall guy to take the blame before the federal government tore Vanguard Horizon apart. They chose Leo Garrison. Leo was a 22-year-old junior data analyst who sat 3 cubicles down from me. He was painfully naive, the kind of gentle kid who brought donuts for the night shift and nervously stammered whenever a supervisor looked his way. He was the perfect, defenseless scapegoat. They did not just fire him, they annihilated him. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a tactical unit kicked in the door of Leo's cramped apartment. These were not regular field agents. They were federal operators deep in Preston's pocket, bought and paid for with dirty money. They dragged Leo out into the freezing rain in nothing but his sleepwear, shackled him like a terrorist, and threw him into a black government vehicle. Right now. He was sitting in a windowless solitary confinement cell. I knew the tactics these corrupt agents used. They would keep him awake for 72 hours, blasting noise, depriving him of water, and feeding him lies until his mind broke and he confessed to a crime he lacked both the malice and the intelligence to commit. The corporate executives at Vanguard Horizon demanded immediate answers, so they put their best forensic investigator on the case. Me. For 48 straight hours, I isolated the breach, tracing the digital footprints through layers of encrypted proxies. The perpetrators had left a breadcrumb trail specifically designed to point the federal investigators directly toward Leo's workstation. I extracted the malicious payload they used to bypass the internal firewalls and decompiled the code. When the raw text finally populated on my screen, my blood ran colder than the air conditioning in the server room. The architecture of the malware was brutally efficient, elegant, and completely invisible to standard security protocols. It was a digital fingerprint I knew intimately. "No," I whispered to the empty room. It was my code. It was a highly classified, proprietary algorithm I had developed during my time in the military, locked away on an encrypted drive inside my personal computer at my apartment. There was only one person on Earth who had access to my home, who knew my routines, and who possessed the sheer, cold-blooded malice to steal it while I was sleeping. Chloe. She had sneaked into my private sanctuary, stolen my life's work, and weaponized it to frame an innocent boy. All to protect the tens of millions of dollars she and Preston had pocketed from enemies of the state. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was a jagged, twisting pain that reminded me that to the Caldwell family, I was never a daughter or a sister. I was just a stray dog they kept around for utility, a scarred failure they could discard whenever it suited their bottom line. Most people would have broken down. Most people would have stormed into Preston's mahogany-paneled chambers, screaming and demanding justice. But I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly closed my laptop, the black screen reflecting the twisted, burned flesh of my neck and jaw. They thought I was just a broken civilian now. They forgot what I was trained to do. I slipped my encrypted drive into my pocket and stood up from the desk. I was going dark. I was going to launch a shadow investigation, tear their perfect lives apart piece by piece, and burn their empire to the ground. The hunt had begun. Vanishing from the radar required absolute discipline. I left my vehicle in a long-term parking lot, disabled every tracking chip in my civilian electronics, and moved like a shadow through the city. My target was an unmarked, brutalist concrete structure hidden within a sprawling industrial park on the rainy outskirts of Seattle. Chloe was incredibly arrogant, but she was not entirely stupid. She knew corporate servers were constantly monitored, so she had set up a private, off-site server farm to broker her treasonous deals. She paid a premium for physical security, relying on commercial-grade biometric scanners and continuous perimeter surveillance. But those systems were designed to stop corporate thieves, not a ghost trained by the United States government. I approached the blind spot of the Eastern security camera, counting the seconds in my head. At exactly 22 seconds past midnight, the lens panned away. I slipped beneath its arc, jammed a localized signal disruptor into the magnetic lock of the maintenance door, and forced the heavy steel open. The descent into the underground data center was like stepping into a mechanical tomb. Row upon row of black server racks hummed with a deafening, monotonous roar, illuminated only by the sterile, pulsating glow of blue and green status lights to keep the processors from overheating. The ambient temperature was locked at a brutal 55 degrees. The moment the freezing air hit my skin, the nightmare began. The severe drop in temperature violently attacked the compromised nerve endings clustered along my left arm. What began as a dull ache instantly escalated into a blinding, white-hot spike of agony that shot straight up into my neck. I collapsed to one knee, my breath catching in my throat as my fingers curled into a rigid claw. The sterile hum of the server room faded away. The blue lights blurred, bleeding into the blinding, merciless yellow sun of a Middle Eastern desert. It was 6 years ago. The air was suffocatingly hot, thick with the metallic taste of blood and the choking stench of burning diesel. My tactical unit had breached a fortified insurgent compound. Military intelligence indicated that a massive data cache was hidden inside their subterranean command center, but the enemy had anticipated our arrival. They had rigged the entire mainframe with hundreds of pounds of military-grade explosives. The timer was counting down. My squad leader grabbed my harness, screaming over the gunfire for an immediate evacuation. But I knew what was on those drives. They contained the active coordinates of embedded sleeper cells preparing to strike civilian targets on American soil. I could not walk away. I ripped myself from his grip and sprinted back into the rigged server room, tearing the primary hard drives from their bays with my bare hands. I had just secured the final drive against my chest when the detonator tripped. The blast wave hit me with the force of a freight train, throwing me violently against a reinforced concrete wall. But it was not the impact that destroyed me. It was the fire. A torrential wall of pure, liquid flame washed over my left side. I remembered the sickening, sweet smell of my own flesh melting, the synthetic fabric of my uniform fusing permanently into my skin, and the agonizing, inhuman screams that I only later realized were coming from my own throat. I remembered the frantic medevac flight, the endless months of excruciating skin grafts, and the permanent, jagged landscape of thick, puckered scar tissue that now stretched from my knuckles all the way to my jawline. "Focus!" I hissed to myself, my voice echoing faintly over the roar of the cooling fans. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, using the fresh pain to anchor myself back in the freezing reality of the Seattle server room. I forced my crippled, trembling fingers to uncurl and plugged my decryption terminal into the master network switch. Chloe had routed the stolen power grid blueprints through an elaborate, dizzying maze of offshore shell companies. She had bounced the encrypted data packets from the Cayman Islands to Zurich, and finally to a dark web routing point. It was a sophisticated smokescreen, but she lacked the operational discipline of a true operative. She had lazily reused her digital security certificates across multiple proxy nodes. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tearing through her firewalls with brutal, surgical precision. I shattered the final encryption layer and cracked the master node. The screen flooded with the absolute truth. I isolated the unmasked digital signatures. I found the real Internet Protocol logs, originating directly from Preston's luxury estate. And there, buried in the ledger, was the undeniable proof, a verified, untraceable transfer of $15 million deposited into a classified trust fund under the Caldwell family name. I pulled a heavy, titanium-cased encrypted drive from my utility pouch and initiated the data siphon. Every single packet of their treason, every shredded document, and every damning financial record flowed into my hands. When the progress bar finally hit 100%, I yanked the drive free. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out the only piece of armor that still made me feel safe. It was my old military tactical jacket. It was faded olive drab, frayed at the cuffs, and permanently stained with the memory of a life I had left behind. I slipped it over my shoulders, feeling the heavy, rigid collar press comfortably against the thick scars on my neck. Sewn deep inside the left breast pocket was a custom Faraday cage, lined with a dense copper mesh designed to block all electromagnetic frequencies. I dropped the titanium drive into the Faraday pocket and sealed the zipper. The evidence was now completely invisible to the world, immune to any remote wiping, tracking, or scanning technology. But as I turned toward the exit, my burner phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. It was an automated, high-priority alert, forwarded by a trusted contact deep inside the federal clerk's office. I opened the encrypted message, and a wave of pure, absolute rage washed over me. It was an emergency subpoena, bearing the official seal of the federal district court. Preston was not just rushing the trial to silence Leo. I was orchestrating a public execution, and he had just drafted me to be the executioner. He had used his absolute judicial authority to legally compel me to take the stand as the prosecution's star expert witness at 8 o'clock the very next morning. Preston knew my reputation in the global cybersecurity community was unimpeachable. He intended to use my pristine credibility to validate the forged evidence Chloe had planted. He was going to force me to look at the jury and swear under oath that Leo Garrison was the traitor. If I refused to testify, Preston would immediately hold me in contempt of court, throw me into a federal holding cell, and silence me forever. He thought he had trapped me in an inescapable corner. He thought his subpoena was a leash around my neck. The Seattle Federal District Court was designed to make ordinary citizens feel utterly insignificant. Walking into the main courtroom for the preliminary hearing felt like stepping into a perfectly sanitized, suffocating vacuum. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above, adorned with intricate gold leaf that mocked the desperate people standing below. The entire space reeked of expensive floor wax, aged mahogany, and the heavy, arrogant musk of designer colognes worn by the corporate executives filling the gallery. They sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in hushed, hungry tones, eager to see a traitor publicly slaughtered so their company stock could bounce back. This was not a sanctuary dedicated to the pursuit of justice. It was a theatrical stage built to protect the elite, a pristine altar designed specifically for a blood sacrifice. Looming high above the gallery, seated behind a massive, elevated wooden bench, was my stepfather. Honorable Judge Preston Caldwell wore his black judicial robes like a king wearing a velvet mantle. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his face was set in a rigid mask of solemn duty. But beneath that practiced facade, I could see the absolute corruption radiating from his posture. He was orchestrating a legal slaughter with terrifying efficiency. Within the first 20 minutes of the hearing, he systematically dismantled the law he had sworn to uphold. When Leo's overworked public defender attempted to file standard evidentiary motions to delay the proceedings, Preston casually waved his hand and denied them before the man could even finish his sentence. He was fast-tracking the entire procedure, ruthlessly suffocating due process to ensure the guilty verdict was locked in place before the afternoon recess. Down in the well of the court, the visual contrast between the predator and the prey was sickening. At the prosecution table sat my half-sister, Chloe. She was dressed in a flawless, tailored white designer suit that probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. She looked pristine, radiant, and entirely untouchable. She leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, casually tapping a gold pen against her notepad. A cold, triumphant smile played on her lips, the exact expression of a vicious predator that had successfully cornered a wounded animal and was taking its time before delivering the killing bite. Sitting mere feet away at the defense table, Leo Garrison looked like a hollow, broken shell of the gentle kid I used to know. The 22-year-old boy was entirely swallowed by an oversized, bright orange county jail uniform. His wrists and ankles were bound tightly by thick, heavy steel chains. Every time a wave of exhaustion or terror caused his frail body to shiver violently, the cold metal clinked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, a sound that cut through the silence of the room. His skin had taken on a sickly, translucent gray hue from days of sleep deprivation and aggressive interrogation. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely vacant. He stared up at Preston, and then over at Chloe, with a profound, quiet despair. He knew he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary for a crime he did not commit, and he had no strength left to fight it. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung shut as the bailiff loudly called my name. I walked down the center aisle, the rhythmic, heavy thud of my boots echoing against the marble floor. Underneath, I wore standard civilian clothes, but over them, I wore my faded, stiff olive drab tactical jacket. In this magnificent room dripping with extreme wealth, custom tailoring, and judicial elegance, my combat-worn jacket was an aggressive, ugly anomaly. The thick collar stood up high, intentionally brushing against the jagged, puckered burn scars that crawled up my neck. I was bringing the dirty, violent reality of the world they profited from right onto their pristine floors. The heavy fabric, concealing the titanium drive safely inside its shielded pocket, brushed against the swinging wooden gate as I entered the well of the court. I stepped onto the witness stand, raised my right hand, and swore an oath to tell the whole truth. Preston stared down at me from his elevated throne, his dark eyes flashing with a silent, threatening command, silently ordering me to play my part. Chloe stood up, smoothing the pristine lapels of her white jacket, and confidently approached the podium. The atmosphere in the courtroom instantly froze, thickening into solid ice. She did not ask questions to discover facts. She wove elaborate, suffocating traps designed to force my hand. "Miss Carlson," Chloe began, her voice echoing through the microphones, dripping with a sickening, artificial sympathy. As the lead forensic investigator for Vanguard Horizon, you spent the last 48 hours analyzing the complex malware used in this devastating national security breach. I want you to confirm for the court, and for the record, that the highly sophisticated, proprietary algorithm used to bypass our internal firewalls was extracted directly from the personal workstation of the defendant, Leo Garrison. Is that correct? She stared directly into my eyes, her victorious smile tightening at the corners. She was waiting for me to pull the lever on the gallows she and her father had built. I looked at the perfectly manicured corporate lawyer standing before me. I looked at the terrified, trembling against his heavy steel chains. Then I leaned forward, bringing my mouth inches from the microphone. "No," I said. The single syllable dropped into the silent courtroom like a heavy stone plunging into a frozen lake. Chloe blinked. Her triumphant, predatory smile fractured for a fraction of a second. She rapidly shifted her weight, gripping her gold pen tighter to regain her composure. "Let me rephrase the question for you, Miss Carlson," Chloe snapped, her voice tightening into a high, defensive pitch. "Did you, or did you not, trace the specific routing protocol of the malicious payload directly back to the physical hardware located at the defendant's desk?" "The routing protocol was deliberately spoofed," I answered. My voice was entirely flat, stripped of all emotion. I delivered the words with the cold, mechanical precision of a ballistic missile striking its target. The physical hardware at the defendant's desk acted merely as a blind, passive relay node. The core execution script bypassed his local area network entirely. It required a highly secure, localized administrative override, a clearance level which a junior analyst absolutely does not possess. Furthermore, the source code was planted on his drive posthumously to the actual network breach. Chloe's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She stepped aggressively away from her table and marched toward the podium. "You are deliberately attempting to confuse the jury with irrelevant technical jargon. The encrypted server logs clearly and undeniably show his personal login credentials executing the data transfer. Login credentials can be digitally cloned and deployed in exactly 3 seconds using a standard brute force decryption tool." I fired back instantly, cutting her off before she could build momentum. "The raw metadata embedded deep within the payload explicitly contradicts the physical typing cadence of the defendant. It is a fabricated digital footprint. It is a sloppy, amateurish, and manufactured lie." The courtroom instantly erupted into a chaotic, deafening murmur. The corporate executives in the gallery began whispering frantically. Chloe was drowning in the very trap she had built. She looked frantically up at the elevated wooden bench, her eyes pleading for a lifeline. Preston's face was a rigid mask of furious, trembling rage. The thick veins in his neck bulged violently against his starched white collar. He could not stand watching his golden child humiliated in public. He could not let his treasonous, multi-million-dollar empire crumble because of my defiance. Bong, bong, bong. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a deafening, violent crack. The sharp noise slashed through the frantic whispers of the gallery, instantly shocking the massive room into a terrified, breathless silence. "Silence in my court!" Preston roared. He leaned heavily over the massive wooden desk. The polished, respectable veneer of the impartial federal judge was completely gone. In its place sat the vicious, abusive tyrant I had known for 20 years. He bypassed the defense counsel, entirely ignored the jury, and aimed his unhinged hatred directly at me. "You are completely out of line. Witness," he hissed into his microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "You were brought here under a strict federal subpoena to verify the physical evidence provided by the prosecution, not to spin wild, baseless conspiracy theories to protect a confirmed traitor. I am providing a factual, unassailable forensic analysis of the digital evidence, Your Honor," I replied, my gaze locked fiercely onto his dark eyes. "The prosecution's evidence is entirely compromised." "The only thing compromised in this room is your pathetic sanity," Preston shouted, spitting the words with pure venom. The short, brutal sentences echoed aggressively off the vaulted ceiling. "You have always been mentally unstable. You are a complete, undeniable disgrace to the Caldwell family name. You stand in my prestigious courtroom, spouting paranoid delusions, desperately clinging to the pathetic fantasy of your days rolling around in foreign mud. Gasps rippled violently through the packed gallery. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands frozen in shock over her machine. Down at the defense table, even Leo flinched against his heavy steel chains, terrified by the sudden explosion of raw hatred. "You think you are so morally superior to everyone here," Preston sneered. His voice dropped into a guttural, disgusted growl that amplified through the heavy speakers. "Look at you. Look at how you present yourself in a federal courtroom. You look like a deranged, homeless vagrant. You are a visual insult to the dignity and honor of this institution." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "I will not have my courtroom degraded by your filthy, disrespectful delusions," he barked, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Take off that filthy tactical jacket. Take it off right now. You will show some absolute respect for the law, or I will throw you in a cell." I did not move, did not blink. I stood perfectly still on the wooden witness stand. The heavy, faded olive drab fabric rested comfortably against the horrific, twisted burn scars covering my arms and torso. Inside the left breast pocket, resting safely within the copper mesh Faraday cage, the titanium drive, containing his absolute destruction, felt like a burning coal against my ribs. My absolute? Stony silence pushed him over the very edge of reason. Preston Caldwell completely lost control. He stood abruptly up from his elevated leather chair, looming ominously over the entire room. His face was a dark, bruised purple with unhinged fury. He leaned violently forward, placing his mouth mere inches from the microphone. "You think you are a real soldier?" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical, unbridled rage. "You think you are some kind of untouchable military ghost? You think your Wraith 7 call sign makes you a hero? It is just a piece of garbage joke. You are nothing but a scarred, broken failure." The name tore through the highly amplified audio system with the force of a physical blow. Wraith 7. The scream echoed violently against the gold leaf ceiling. It ricocheted sharply off the polished mahogany panels. It bled out through the heavy double oak doors at the back of the room, spilling out into the vast, silent marble hallways of the federal building. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to break me down to absolute nothingness in front of the world. But my arrogant stepfather made one fatal, irreversible mistake. He did not realize what he had just done. He did not know that a military call sign is not just a name, it is a highly classified beacon, and he had just broadcasted it at the exact right moment, to the exact right people. The violent echo of that classified call sign faded into the vaulted ceiling, leaving behind a suffocating, dead silence. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the massive courtroom was the frantic, shallow breathing of the corporate spectators in the gallery. Up on his elevated mahogany throne, Preston Caldwell sneered, his chest heaving with arrogant satisfaction. He raised a trembling hand and aggressively signaled the armed court security officers standing near the walls. Two heavily built bailiffs immediately unclipped their steel handcuffs and stepped forward to drag me off the witness stand. But halfway across the polished floor, they suddenly froze in their tracks. A bizarre, heavy shift in the air pressure had just sucked all the oxygen from the room. A low, rhythmic rumble began to vibrate through the solid wood floorboards, originating from the marble hallway outside. It was not the sound of approaching civilians or panicked reporters. It was the synchronized, heavy marching of combat boots. Before anyone could draw a breath, the massive, 12-foot double oak doors at the rear of the courtroom did not merely open, they were violently eradicated. A concussive force kicked them inward with such extreme brutal velocity that the heavy brass hinges sheared clean off the door frames. The heavy wooden slabs slammed against the walls with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of a localized explosion. A thick cloud of splintered wood and dust blasted into the pristine, air-conditioned air. The wealthy executives in the gallery screamed in absolute terror, instinctively covering their heads and diving beneath the wooden pews, their expensive designer suits pressing against the dirty floor. Stepping through the settling dust was a towering figure clad in a pristine, dark military dress uniform. 4 solid silver stars gleamed with ruthless, undeniable authority on each of his broad shoulders. It was General Bradley Clayton, the Supreme Commander of the United States Cyber Command. The general did not come alone. Flooding into the room behind him was a full, heavily armed, tactical squad of federal military police. These were not local precinct cops looking to collect a municipal paycheck. They were elite operators draped in heavy, matte black ballistic armor, carrying fully loaded, short-barreled assault rifles strapped securely across their chests. The soldiers moved with terrifying, completely silent precision. In less than 3 seconds, they fanned out across the rear of the gallery, blocking the destroyed doors and securing every single exit. The sharp, metallic clicks of weapons being switched off their safety catches echoed sharply through the terrified room, accompanied by the red glow of laser sights sweeping the perimeter. It was a grim, undeniable promise of overwhelming lethal force. Over in the jury box, the 12 citizens shrank down into their seats, paralyzed by the sudden transformation of a civilian court into a secured military zone. General Clayton did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice to command the space. His sheer physical presence consumed all the power in the room, instantly reducing the local legal proceedings to a pathetic, meaningless joke. He began to walk down the long center aisle. The courtroom was so entirely paralyzed with fear that the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic strike of his polished military boots. Each step he took echoed against the hardwood floor like a heavy steel hammer driving nails straight into the coffin of the Caldwell family empire. At the prosecution table, Chloe scrambled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. The vicious, predatory smile she had worn all morning completely evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed, unadulterated panic. She opened her mouth to object, desperately wanting to use her corporate lawyer tactics to regain control. But the words died in her throat. Her flawless white designer suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like a flag of desperate surrender. Over at the defense table, young Leo Garrison slowly raised his head. His exhausted, bloodshot eyes widened as he watched the tactical squad secure the room. The heavy steel chains around his wrists clinked softly as he gripped the edge of the table, realizing that the cavalry had just shattered the walls of his prison. General Clayton completely ignored the lawyers, treating them like insignificant insects on the floor. He marched straight into the well of the court, ascending the wooden steps of the witness stand without breaking his stride. He smoothly and deliberately positioned his broad frame directly between me and the 2 trembling local bailiffs. The court security officers immediately backed away, their hands falling uselessly away from their utility belts. They were local men who understood the difference between municipal authority and absolute, unrestrained federal military power. They looked up at the 4 stars on the general's shoulders and realized they were completely out of their depth. General Clayton stared down the bailiffs, his eyes colder than the frozen vacuum of space. When he finally spoke, his voice was not amplified by any microphone, yet it sliced through the dead silence with razor-sharp, terrifying clarity. If any local official in this room dares to lay a single finger on a senior intelligence officer of the United States military, I will personally drag that individual before a federal military tribunal and prosecute them for high treason against the Republic. The words hung in the air, dripping with a lethal, absolute promise. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it was violently shattered into a million pieces. Up on the elevated wooden bench, the color violently drained from Preston Caldwell's face, leaving his skin the sickly, translucent pale of a fresh corpse. His jaw hung open in pathetic disbelief. The arrogant, untouchable tyrant who had ruled this city with an iron fist suddenly realized he was nothing but a corrupt, minor bureaucrat, playing a highly dangerous game with a global superpower. All his political connections, his offshore bank accounts, and his country club friends meant absolutely nothing against a 4-star general threatening a military tribunal. And he had just lost everything. His trembling fingers lost their tight grip. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his sweaty palm, tumbling off the high desk. It hit the hardwood floor below with a hollow, pathetic clatter. Local corruption was utterly, hopelessly defenseless against the supreme might of the federal government. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Preston's earlier, enraged command for me to remove my jacket still echoed in my memory, standing safely behind the broad, imposing frame of the four-star general. I locked my eyes directly onto my stepfather's pale, trembling face. I reached up to the collar of my faded olive-drab jacket. The sharp, metallic rasp of the heavy brass zipper descending cut through the dead air of the room. In the breathtaking quiet, it sounded like the unsheathing of a sword. I pulled my arms free and let the heavy, weather-beaten garment slide slowly off my shoulders, draping it carefully over the wooden railing of the witness stand. For the first time in over 6 years, the full, unfiltered reality of my sacrifice was exposed to the civilian world. The harsh, artificial lights of the courtroom illuminated the horrific, violent landscape of my left arm, shoulder, and neck. Thick, twisted bands of deep red and purple scar tissue coiled tightly around my muscles, pulling the skin taut in jagged, unnatural patterns where the liquid fire had melted my synthetic uniform directly into my flesh. It was not a sight that belonged in a civilized, mahogany-lined room. It belonged in the brutal, unforgiving desert of a war zone. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the wealthy corporate executives in the gallery. Several people physically recoiled in their wooden pews, looking away in sheer horror. But General Bradley Clayton did not look away. He saw the devastating burns not as a deformity, but as a map of supreme loyalty and unyielding courage. The commanding officer of the United States Cyber Command immediately snapped his polished boots together. He straightened his back, raised his right hand in a sharp, crisp motion, and delivered the most formal, honorable military salute directly to me. It was a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect that shattered every single insult my stepfather had hurled my way. I did not want their pity. I did not need their horror. I lowered my head respectfully to acknowledge the general, then turned my attention back to the jacket resting on the wooden rail. With calm, deliberate precision, I reached into the hidden pocket lined with the copper Faraday mesh. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal of the titanium-encased encrypted drive. I pulled it out and held it up between my thumb and index finger, across the room. Chloe stared at the small silver device, her eyes dilated in absolute terror. The color vanished entirely from her flawless face. As a ruthless corporate lawyer, she knew exactly what an off-grid data siphon looked like. She knew instantly that I had found her private underground servers. "This drive contains the complete, unredacted architecture of your treason," I announced. My voice was no longer a defensive whisper. It was the cold, surgical edge of a scalpel cutting away a lethal cancer. It holds the raw, unencrypted data packets containing the stolen blueprints of the West Coast power grid. More importantly, it contains the exact digital signatures used to authorize the transfer to our foreign adversaries. Not Leo Garrison's forged credentials, but the authentic, verified biometrics of Chloe Caldwell. Furthermore, I have traced the routing internet protocol addresses directly back to the private network of Judge Preston Caldwell's primary residential estate. I paused, letting the crushing weight of the federal espionage charges suffocate the room. The ledger also contains the undeniable financial proof, I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly off the gold leaf ceiling. A direct, untraceable wire transfer of exactly $15 million, deposited into a classified offshore trust fund controlled exclusively by the Caldwell family. There was no legal maneuver left. There was no objection that could save them from the avalanche of federal justice. General Clayton slowly lowered his hand from his salute. He gave a single, curt nod to his tactical squad. The heavily armed military police officers moved with terrifying, organized efficiency. They bypassed the local security and swarmed the prosecution table, while another team stormed up the wooden steps to the elevated judicial bench. The sharp, heavy metallic clicks of steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly shut, echoed violently through the room. Chloe collapsed to her knees, her pristine white designer suit crumpling against the dirty floor as she began sobbing hysterically, frantically begging anyone who would listen that it was all her father's idea. Up on the bench, Preston Caldwell was physically dragged out of his high-backed leather chair. The untouchable, arrogant federal judge was instantly reduced to a pathetic, crying old man. He screamed wildly for mercy, demanding federal immunity, and calling for his political allies as the soldiers forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. Their screams and tears were utterly pathetic, completely meaningless against the crushing weight of their own greed. I ignored the chaotic, satisfying destruction of the Caldwell Empire. I stepped down from the witness stand and walked straight toward the defense table. I looked down at the two local bailiffs who had tried to arrest me only moments earlier. "Take the chains off him," I ordered. The bailiffs did not hesitate. They fumbled frantically with their keys, their hands shaking as they unlocked the heavy steel shackles binding Leo's wrists and ankles. The moment the cold metal dropped heavily to the hardwood floor, the young data analyst buried his face in his hands and broke down into violent, uncontrollable sobs. He cried because he knew he was finally safe. He knew his life had just been handed back to him. I walked back to the witness stand, picked up my faded tactical jacket, and slipped it safely back over my scarred shoulders. The heavy fabric wrapped around me like a familiar, comforting embrace. I walked back down the center aisle, falling into step beside General Clayton. Leo Garrison stumbled closely behind us, guided and protected by the federal soldiers. We marched straight out of the shattered double oak doors, leaving the rotten, corrupt bloodline of my past screaming in the ruins of their own making. As we stepped out through the massive front doors of the courthouse, the bright, warming sunlight of the Seattle morning washed over my face. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air and smiled a genuine smile of profound relief. I finally realized the absolute truth. Family is not determined by the DNA running through your veins or the name printed on a birth certificate. True family are the people who are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with you in the darkest, most terrifying shadows, ready to fight the monsters by your side. Thank you so much to all of our incredible listeners for tuning in to today's story. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Please let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story, I want to gently remind you that because YouTube has unfortunately disabled our monetization, we will not be uploading any new videos here in the near future, and we are moving all our operations to Patreon. Please help us keep this channel alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you can listen to our very best, exclusive, long-form true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now, or use the Patreon link provided in the description and the pinned comment to join us. Thank you again, and we cannot wait to see you there.